Well, if you talk to 100 different experts about how to revitalize the
Hmm.
church, guess what? How many answers are you going to get?
Oh, yeah, about 100.
I get about 100
No,
different ones, and they're
absolutely.
not all the same.
Mm-mm.
Everybody's got an opinion. There's all kinds of books and resources to talk to. There's no shortage of how to do it,
Hmm.
and there's no real set way of doing it. Right now, we want to hear from a group that is doing it right and revitalizing churches all over New England as part of the Overseed Project.
The name came from my wife, believe it or not. She was looking out our window at our lawn that had just sort of survived the winter and needed some attention. And she thought, well, that's just like these churches. They need overseeded with the gospel. And she said, hey, Jim, I got an idea for you. And it stuck.
So, when was it that you first started to notice the need for this or that there was a problem?
It's funny. When I was in college, I used to walk by a lot of the large, mainline churches that had dwindled down to not much, and used to scheme of ways like, is there a way to bring life back to these things? And then I forgot about it. And in my early 40s, I decided to go to seminary and came down to Massachusetts to finish. And I had some friends who recommended a church up the street, congregational church, and ended up being a UCC church that had been revitalized and was, Bible believing church. It had been revitalized in the late 60s. So by the time I got there, I didn't know any of the history. But I wondered why someone would do that. I was more in the church planting movement. I'd been approved to go into church planting by Converge, and I was just waiting to finish and go do that. And God began to stir. And so I began to meet with this pastor and just ask him, like, well, what did you do? How did you do this? And was just fascinated at how God had used him to turn around this church and how people had come to Christ, and began to realize that in many ways we had a missionary opportunity in New England in existing churches, that people were coming, but they weren't necessarily hearing the gospel. So it was that. And then I was in the middle of Boston on a youth group trip, and it was about 5:30 in the morning. Couldn't sleep, so I got up to get coffee, and I was walking down the street, and I came around the corner, and here was a congregational church, trying to raise $12,000 to fix the roof, and it probably sat 400 or 500 people, which meant there was probably 20 people in the church. And I just had a conversation with God. It's like, okay, so if I was going to plant a church in Dorchester, where would I go? There's no more land. And I could see the movie theater, I could see an office complex. And I thought, well, all of those would work. But what if we thought about how to reinvigorate all these churches that dot the landscape of America and figure out how to bring them back to life? And it was like God said to me that morning, that's what I want you to figure out. And of course, I'm not the only one thinking about it. But yeah, it was on a street corner in Dorchester where God kind of called me into this movement. It wasn't my background other than daydreaming in college. So I had a lot to learn.
Well, I assume that this problem is not one that's limited only to New England. This is going on all over the country.
Oh, it is. There are, probably thousands of churches, tens of thousands of churches that need revitalization. And as we've looked at, and again, my landscape is New England, I decided I didn't want to live my life on an airplane, so we focused to where we could drive. But as we have looked at churches and as I did research, to me, there's two fundamental problems that the churches in America are facing. The first is what I would call missional shift. That for whatever reason, the gospel mission is no longer the driving heartbeat of the church. Either it's turned inward or the people have gotten old and tired. There's some good reasons, some bad reasons for that. But then there's also been theological shift. And when you combine those two, it's deadly. So depending on how long this has been going on, the road to health is complicated because you've got theological repair work to do. You have to engender a new passion for mission. Um, and it's just not easy. We stumbled across a term that we like to use called patient catalyst, that we're looking for pastors who can do that difficult work. In some ways, revitalization is the intersection of a church plant and a chaplaincy. And that's what makes it so hard. You've got to take care of the people that call you to the church who are worthy of attention. And yet you've got to be a catalyst for something new. And if you're in a hurry, you get to find a new job. If you're in no hurry at all, you get to close the doors. And so there's this challenge of leadership of doing both of those simultaneously. And it's not easy.
You mentioned Patient Catalyst, which is the name of a book by Jack Daniel. Is that kind of the, is this, for lack of a better term, the Bible of the overseed movement?
Well, Jack is our field director. So, yes, he took a church in North Andover. It was down to about 55 people. They were going to close it. And they decided to take one more chance on this young pastor and his wife. And he ended up staying there 35 years, and the church just blossomed from about 60 people to about 1,200 people over the course of 35 years. And so it's kind of Jack's experience laid down in terms of what are the principles that he learned as he watched God revitalize the church that he pastored.
And he seems to talk about each church being in a different stage, that they are, in a sense, in life cycles. And when you consider that, is there any such point at when a church becomes irredeemably lost in terms of being able to save it?
Jack and I actually don't agree on this. Jack would say yes, and I would say no. I think that, as God said to Elijah, looking out over the valley of dry bones, can these bones live? And the answer is yes. Now, does God want to redeem every church? Doesn't seem to be the case, but can he? Yes. And so it's a question of what does the Spirit want to do here? Life cycle is one way to look at a church. Life cycle meaning, churches kind of mirror the life cycle of a human being. There's birth, there's adolescence, there's maturity, and then oftentimes there's decline and death. If you look at Revelation 2 and 3, the model that Jesus seems to use to define the stage of a church is really its relationship to the gospel. You start with Ephesians, where pretty theologically solid, but they kind of drifted emotionally from their love for Jesus. And as you walk through the different churches, by the time you get to Laodicea, there's no difference between the church and the world. And the gospel is, they're just living on fumes of a past message. So that's another way to look at the stages of church. And when you get to Laodicea, Jesus is almost on the outside knocking on the door saying, hey, I'd love to revitalize you if you'd let me in.
There seem to be two equally important components in this process, one of which would be the pastor and the other which would be the congregation. Is there one that's more significant than the other, or obviously you have to have both working together?
I think it depends on the starting point. The starting point of many churches in New England is not so good. And so the pastor, in many ways, is absolutely critical because he's got to do the repair work theologically. Oftentimes, there's been long-term conflict. There's a lot of hurt relationships. So um, there's just a lot of repair work to be done that takes a leader. But sooner or later, God calls the church to mission. And so the pastor alone can't reach a community. It takes the whole church. So they're both important. I would say the pastor probably, like Ephesians 4, where God says he gave some to equip the saints to do the work of ministry. If you got no one doing the equipping, typically the saints don't do the work of ministry. And so is the pastor more important? I don't know if I would use that word, but he's certainly critical to the overall process.
And I think Jack also uses a comparison where he talks about a church and its pastor is like a marriage. And just like you go through stages of a marriage with honeymoon and all that, the same thing happens in churches. Do you like that analogy?
I do. I think it's helpful to realize that there's a dynamic to the relationship, that it's not static, which is true of much of the church. And I think Jack does a good job of pointing out how it's easy to misunderstand what those stages mean. Like you take the honeymoon stage, many pastors are given a kind of unusual amount of freedom, and they can easily mistake that for agreement rather than doing the hard work of getting to know the church, building those relationships, and finding out, okay, who are they really pastoring? Rather than just assuming everybody knows him and is on board. Not that they don't like him, but it takes time to build those working relationships.
You've had good success with this in New England, and now Overseed is kind of spreading out a little bit. I know it's going into the Midwest somewhat tentatively now. Is that the plan, to take this process onto a bigger stage?
That's a great question. The mindset has always been our focus is New England, but we're more than willing to take what we've learned and give it away. And so, Jim Barnes, who I had met probably 10 years ago, I mentioned that to him. And he called me up about a year ago and said, "Hey, were you serious about that?" And I said, "Absolutely. I'd love to help you replicate what we're doing and take it and run with it." So we're more than open to helping other areas if they're willing to own it long term, to help them get started.
You said one of the things you're interested in doing is taking what you've learned and then sharing it with others. Let's crystallize this now in one or two big picture lessons. What have you learned that's important for other struggling congregations to know?
One, the pastor has to be intentional. This is a lot of work. And so the pastor has to be intentional about leadership development, about discipleship and evangelism. So buzzwords the church has used since, Matthew 28, but in many ways it's the same thing. The challenge is, depending on the state of the church, you're inviting people into a dysfunctional family, which may not be all that attractive. Or the style of worship, needs to be modified, but you can't do that overnight. And so I think one of the challenges for a pastor on the catalyst side is he has to recruit people to a vision, not to what is. To say, hey, join me in this work, and we're going to get there. We're not in a hurry. We love the people that are here, but here's where I'm going. So vision becomes very important on the catalyst side. And then on the patient side, the kind of chaplaincy side, the pastor has to truly love the people that called him. Younger guys can kind of look, which typically an older congregation, you can kind of look at them as in the way. rather than the people he's been called to love and to serve. And if he does a good job of loving them and serving them, then they will give him the freedom to be a catalyst. And so you got to kind of walk that balance. So to me, those are, change management is a critical lesson, but it's pace, it's timing, and it's truly loving people, loving your community. And probably the last lesson would be it can take 5 to 15 years to revitalize a church, depending on the starting point. So you got to be in it for the long haul.
Again, the book is Patient Catalyst by Jack Daniel, available on Amazon. The group is Overseed, which you can find out more about on their website. And the speaker, the director, is Dr. Jim Harrell. And Jim, we thank you for your time. We appreciate it greatly. Thank